All right. Good afternoon, everybody, on this 10th day of June in 2022. Welcome to the 11th in a series of 12 presentations in honor of the 100th anniversary of the Council for Exceptional Children. Thank you to Illinois Council for Exceptional Children for hosting this series. Today, we warmly welcome Dr. Paul Morgan's presentation, Equity in Special Education. Paul Morgan, Ph.D., is the Harry and Marion Royer Eberly Fellow and Professor of Education and Demography, Department of Educational Studies at the Pennsylvania State University at University Park, Pennsylvania. Paul Morgan received his Ph.D. from Vanderbilt University, Nashville, his master's degree from University of Virginia, Charlottesville, his bachelor's degree from the University of Oregon, Eugene. Dr. Morgan's research focuses on cognition, human development, learning processes, educational policy, race and ethnicity, policy analysis, quantitative research, ADHD, early intervention, inclusion, and mild disabilities. Dr. Morgan has authored and co-authored over 70 peer-reviewed publications, including empirical studies appearing in Educational Researcher, Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis, Child Development, Developmental Psychology, Pediatrics, and the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. His work has been funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, National Science Foundation, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and the Spencer Foundation. He is a fellow of the American Educational Research Foundation. We extend a warm welcome to Dr. Paul Morgan. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today.
It's certainly my pleasure, and thank you for such a warm introduction, Paula. I look forward to the conversation together. So if I could start, let me just share my screen. So I have a presentation. I can go into as much depth as you would like about some of our research. I probably overplanned being the former special ed teacher that I am. So what I'll try to do is I'll talk for about 30 minutes or so. There's more than I had planned, but I'd like to just stop and then leave time for some dialogue and questions and however I can be helpful in terms of the conversation together. So let me just share my screen. And then
beautiful, Paul, we see.
Hey. Okay, great. Oh, that slide's shorter. Let me go to slideshow. Great. And okay, so let me minimize this. So, okay, so just some acknowledgement. So this is a collaborative effort between me and other researchers, and we've also received funding from IES, indirectly through an infrastructure grant from NICHD, Spencer Foundation, other sources, but the views that I'm expressing here don't necessarily reflect those of the funding agencies. So I'll talk a little bit about the kind of the federal legislative and regulatory context around significant disproportionality. I'll talk about how we're going about investigating racial and ethnic disparities in disability identification by an overview of our empirical findings, and then I'll end with implications for policy, research, and practice as I see it. So in terms of the legislative and regulatory context, IDEA has been amended to increase monitoring around what's called significant disproportionality in regards to race and ethnicity in terms of identification, placement, and discipline. Most recently through regulations adopted in 2016, which requires states to adopt a standard reporting methodology and set reasonable thresholds for disproportionality. In context, the local context in which disproportionality is occurring, then those localities, the local educational agencies are expected to reallocate 15% of the federal funding to address the observed disproportionality, as well as publicly announce that they're experiencing significant disproportionality in special education. So this significant disproportionality, really, the language is just a difference sufficiently large to be worrisome or concerning and to necessitate attempts to change. And then the observed difference is inferred to result from inappropriate practices, policies, in which are inappropriately resulting in children of different race, ethnicity to be identified, placed, or disciplined. So there's an inference as to the cause that's resulting in these observed differences by race and ethnicity. So you can see an example of some of the reporting that's done around this issue. So this is the most recent report to Congress from the Office of Special Education Programs, and I've highlighted for across 2 different disability conditions, with these estimates varying depending on the specific disability condition and the specific population being examined. You can see some evidence that certain population demographics are more likely to be represented as having certain disabilities than other populations. So if we look at intellectual disability, the department is reporting to Congress that children who are Black or African American are about twice as likely to be identified as having intellectual disabilities than, as computed here by the department, all other racial and ethnic groups combined. And you can see for specific learning disability, you can see some differences in terms of representation for that particular condition. So here, this is showing that Alaskan Native or American Indian children are about twice as likely to have specific learning disabilities as the other racial and ethnic groups. These kinds of differences are resulting in monitoring, including within Illinois. So Illinois is asking local school districts to report on significant disproportionality by disability condition, placement, and discipline. And the state has set specific criteria. So, and these criteria, these thresholds vary by state. In Illinois, if significant disproportionality is observed in identification, placement, or discipline, in identification, including for specific conditions across different racial and ethnic groups, such that the risk ratio is 4 or more across 3 consecutive years, then the locality will have to reallocate its federal funding. And as noted here in the slide, if these risk ratios decline over time, then that'll help remediate concerns about significant disproportionality in the locality. So the type of reporting I was showing to you in the report of Congress and similar types of reports have led to some pretty strong inferences about how special education is functioning. And you can find quite a bit of evidence for this. So terms like these kinds of statistics suggesting a discriminatory practice, systemic bias, special education functioning as a legalized form of structural segregation and racism, a persistent staying on the field, a tool of exclusion. So based on what I would characterize as, descriptive evidence, some pretty strong claims at times about how the system is operating, with those claims suggesting that the way that children are being identified, placed, or disciplined is inappropriate and motivated by racial animus in some type of way. And yet, we should acknowledge some limitations in the available empirical research. Much of it is descriptive in nature, or if including controls for other explanatory factors, tends to do so in ways that have some pretty serious methodological limitations. And the type of factors that others have identified as most likely to be alternative explanatory variables, explanations for the observed disparities have often not been accounted for in the existing empirical work, despite repeated calls for this to occur. And I think it's helpful to just take a moment and kind of understand this from how we might go about studying these differences in these disparities. And this is taken from a report from the Institute of Medicine back in, I think, 2008. 2004, and this figure was published in 2001. And what you have here is you have two different populations, a non-minority and a minority population, and you have an observed difference in the quality of healthcare the two populations are receiving. But that difference might warrant attention, but it could have different explanations. And one of those explanations might be clinical appropriateness and potential patient preferences. That type of explanation we may note, but maybe not be as concerned about as other explanations, which are that the way that the system is operating is somehow unfairly responding to certain populations over others, or is acting in a way that's discriminatory or biased. The first explanation is part of a difference, but the other two are something more, which will be characterized as a disparity. So if we want to know whether the system is operating in some kind of biased or inappropriate manner, then we want to take into account clinical appropriateness and patient preferences before inferring that the observed difference is due to a disparity that has itself inappropriate explanations. The problem is in trying to understand this issue in terms of disability identification, placement, and discipline, there are other explanatory factors that might be resulting for the observed racial disparities. So, for example, children who are Black or American and are much more likely to be exposed to poverty than white or Asian American children. And the problem with this is that poverty increases the exposure to factors that we know are related to disability. Exposure to lead, environmental toxins, smoking during pregnancy, other low birth weight, other factors of this nature. In addition to greater exposure to household poverty, children of color are more likely to be exposed to concentrated poverty within their neighborhood. So this is showing you that about 3 or 4% of white or Asian children are living in neighborhoods where 30% or more of the households are poor, relative to upwards to about 25% of children who are Black or American Indian. The way this translates into something of concern for educational researchers is that differential exposure to poverty is likely resulting in differential achievement differences or academic difficulties. And if we look at the NAEP, we find strong, consistent evidence that children of color are more likely to display academic difficulties than children who are white. From a methodological standpoint, then, we're interested in this relationship between X and Y, race and disability identification, for example. But we have a problem, which is another factor may observe this relationship. So if a researcher says to me, look, boys are suspended more often than girls, gender to discipline, boys being the X and suspension being the Y, and then infers from that the way schools discipline boys is inherently biased, I'm going to ask as a researcher, well, is it possible that boys are acting out more in the classroom than girls, so that the behavioral difference may explain this initially observed difference by gender? So we have a similar problem here. We know that children of color are exposed more to the risk factors for disability, including as a result of exposure to poverty. And so to understand whether bias is operating in the way that we identify, place, or discipline children of color, we should attend to other explanatory factors, including those most directly or materially related to being identified, placed, or disciplined. So the way that we might go about doing that is we would approximate similarly situated contrasts between children, and then observe whether among similarly situated children, some populations of children seem to be differentially treated. That's one of the two ways to examine for bias or discriminatory practice, the other being disparate impact, which we can talk about. This is the standard that's used by the national academies, as well as other organizations, including the Office of Civil Rights and Department of Education, to monitor for potential bias and discriminatory practice. It's also the contrast that often is used in public health, economics, or gifted education. So as an example, in public health, among similarly situated children brought into emergency rooms with elevated temperatures, who's more or less likely to receive follow-up testing and care. So our analytical logic is among similarly situated children, so children who seem observationally similar as a result of other explanatory factors being held constant, who's more or less likely to be identified, placed, or disciplined. And by doing so, we're hoping to better evaluate for potential bias in the way that the special education system is operating. So I'll delve into our empirical findings next, but it's important just to note there is a good deal of anecdotal and descriptive evidence suggesting that children of color are under-identified as having disabilities, including as recently reported in Texas, Illinois, and Michigan. What do we find in terms of our studies? We find repeated evidence of under-identification. We find this prior to and following school entry for disability identification generally, as well as across many specific conditions. We find it in elementary, middle, and high school. We find it whether we use teacher, parent, report, or school record. We find it across, at this point now, 36 national representative samples, including multiple longitudinal samples. We sometimes find overrepresentation, but we find that prior to similarly situated contrasts, and we consistently find when we compare otherwise similar or similarly situated children, that students of color and children from English-speaking homes are more likely to be identified as having disabilities than children of color or those from non-English-speaking households. We've reported this multiple times. I'll just highlight a couple of key studies. One of which, this was not our first study on this topic. We actually published this in 2015. Our first empirical study was published in 2010, finding similar findings. But the 2015 study generated quite a bit of attention and pushback, I would say. So what did we find? Let me just show you a couple of sample tables and figures. So here we've run a type of regression in which we're examining overtime identification for 5 different disability conditions: learning disabilities, speech language impairments, intellectual disabilities, other health impairments, and emotional disturbance, emotional behavioral disorders, in a longitudinal sample followed from kindergarten entry to the end of 8th grade. In the regressions, we've entered in a set of controls, including direct measures of academic achievement and behavioral functioning, as well as many other controls, including family SES, marital status, history of low birth weight, these kinds of factors. And what you see I've highlighted in red, so numbers less than 1, well, the relationship shown here for academic achievement is indicating that as academic achievement goes down, then likelihood of disability identification goes up. And we find that across each of the disability conditions that we observed in this particular study. Children who are better able to attend, be organized, be flexible to changes in classroom routines are less likely to be identified as having disabilities. Children who act out are more likely to be identified for behaviorally related disabilities. Net of these and other explanatory factors, we find consistent evidence that children who are Black and Hispanic are less likely to be identified as having disabilities, as well as for learning disabilities and speech language impairments, children from non-English speaking households. This is showing you just graphically these findings. So as we follow the sample over time, more and more, the way to interpret these figures is more and more children are being identified. That's highlighted, say, in the purple line here for children who are white. As children enter into kindergarten and then continue through the elementary middle school grades to the end of 8th grade, when our data collection ends in this particular study, you see that more children are being identified as having learning disabilities with somewhat flatter trends, which makes sense for speech language impairments. But in addition to increasing identification here for learning disabilities, another trend is evident, which is in children who are observationally similar. By the end of 8th grade, more children who are white have been identified than children who are Hispanic, Black, or of other race and ethnicity. So, for example, in contrast to about 6% of children who are white having been identified as having learning disabilities, only about 3% of children who are Black have been identified despite being otherwise similar in observable characteristics. Another way to look at this is if we look at children who enter into kindergarten displaying clinically significant academic difficulties, here is operationalized by being in the bottom 10% on a total score distribution on 3 different measures of achievement: math, reading, and what's called general knowledge. If you look at who's been identified in 3rd grade, the percentages are consistently higher for children who are white. So relative to about 40% of children who entered in a kindergarten who are white, who are displaying clinically significant reading difficulties, only 22% or so of children who are Black or Hispanic have been identified and are still receiving additional services by 3rd grade. And we see similar findings across the other academic achievement indicators. This study generated quite a bit of pushback, despite not being the first study we conducted on the topic, with some researchers stating that this is overturning 20 years of federal policy, and it must be because of sampling, and if this finding continues to hold, then it would mean that the federal policy we have on this issue would just be plain wrong, as I said. So we've subsequently replicated the findings repeatedly here across cross-sectional, but much larger sample of children in elementary, middle, and high school. We find, again, similar findings that children who are white are more likely than similarly achieving children of color to be identified for disability as having disabilities. And here, I think, gives it sort of an intuitive way of understanding the findings. So if we look at here, this is the way to understand this table is we've broken up the achievement distribution by deciles. And then we've looked at across the achievement distribution deciles, percentages of children who have been identified as having disabilities by different race or ethnicity. So if we take this group here, children who are white, this is saying that for those white children who are in the bottom 10% of the achievement decile, about 75% of those children have been identified as having disabilities and so are receiving services through special education. As achievement increases, you see steady declines in the percentage of children receiving special education. So in contrast to 74% of children who are white in the bottom 10% of the distribution receiving special education, only about 2% of children who are white in the top 10% of the distribution are receiving special ed. The other finding, in addition to as achievement goes up, disability identification goes down, is another finding that I've highlighted, which is across, instead of the columns, across the rows. So relative to children who are displaying the same level of academic difficulties, here, 74% of children who are white are receiving help, who are in the lowest 10% of the reading achievement distribution. Much lower percentages of children who are Black, Hispanic, Asian, American Indian, Pacific Islander, or of multiple races have been identified as having disabilities. So relative to 74% of children who are white in the bottom 10% of the score distribution, 44, 43, and 48% of children who are Black, Hispanic, or American Indian are receiving services. And that disparity across similar levels of achievement is evident across the lower half of the achievement distribution. If we look at this more formally, if we start with who has an IEP in 4th grade in this cross-sectional sample, we see initial evidence of overrepresentation, we might refer as. So children who are Black are more likely to have IEPs than children who are white, but that's before any attempt to control for other explanatory factors. So simply controlling for academic difficulties immediately changes the directionality of the estimate for children who are Black, as well as for children who are Hispanic. So here we see evidence of under-identification among similarly achieving children, as I was highlighting before. As we account for additional explanatory factors, including, in addition, a direct measure of reading achievement, biological sex, whether the child is receiving free or reduced lunch, whether they're English language learner, and a control so that we're comparing children attending the same schools. So school level differences in resources do not explain these findings. We see again evidence of under-identification. And that's true here for disability in general, as well as across specific disability conditions. Here, emotional disturbance, here for specific learning disability, and also, although not significant, here for speech language impairment. If we look at this across time, we see consistent evidence that children who are white are more likely to be identified as having disabilities than similarly achieving children of other race or ethnicity. And that's been evident since 2003. I'll try and kind of go through things a little bit more quickly, but we see this, another criticism we received is, well, you haven't examined specific contexts where racial bias may be especially likely to occur. So we've tried to do that here by looking at a sample of students attending schools in the US South, where we might expect, given the region's history of de jure and de facto racial segregation, that racial bias might be especially likely to occur, such that schools are using special education to segregate students of color. We don't find that to be the case. In fact, we find the same type of pattern when we analyze data collected nationally. So here, across a range of different specific disability conditions, in a sample restricted to the 12 states representing the US South, here in 2015, numbers below 1 mean that group is less likely to be identified. You see some range of estimates by the confidence intervals, but the general pattern is that here, Black and Hispanic children are less likely to be identified as having disabilities than similarly situated children who are white. And that's true both in 4th and 8th grade, as well as across specific states. We've looked at this using just district level data. We've received some criticism that we should look at district level data. I can talk about that. So we tried to do that. And by analyzing other data than we've analyzed previously, if you control for achievement gaps occurring in the schools, you again find evidence of under-identification of Black relative to white students, with that evident in analyses that account for other explanatory factors. But just controlling for achievement is enough to find evidence of under-identification of here Black students relative to white students, as well as for Hispanic students. Looking at this across the school districts that we're able to examine, this is data from about 2,000 school districts across the US. You find a fairly consistent pattern that as achievement gaps go up, the risk ratios in the districts go up. We find that for both Black and Hispanic populations. To look at this a little less messy, this is across sort of bins of achievement. As achievement gaps go up, you find that the risk ratios in the districts go up. So a simple way, one way to explain this finding is schools are responding to academic difficulties in terms of identification. And as an achievement gap grows between Black or Hispanic children and white children in the district, you find that the risk ratio grows between Black or Hispanic children and white children in terms of representation in special education. So achievement and identification seems to be quite strongly related. I won't spend much time here, but we've also looked at this in terms of discipline. We find some suggestive evidence that schools are more likely to suspend children who are Black relative to students who are white, but we don't find evidence that schools are more likely to suspend students with disabilities or students with disabilities who are of color in analyses accounting for behavioral difficulties at the start of kindergarten, which I've shown here. We've also most recently, this study just came out last week, we've looked at placement. When we look at among samples of students with disabilities, you can find some evidence that among students with disabilities, students who are Black or Hispanic are more likely to be placed outside of general education classrooms, but that effect largely is explained by accounting for other explanatory factors, particularly achievement difficulties. So if children enter into kindergarten displaying low levels of academic achievement, they're more likely to be placed outside of classrooms across the remainder of general education classrooms outside of general education classrooms across elementary school. and including controls for that and other explanatory factors, explained initially observed racial and ethnic disparities in placement, which is consistent with some a few other prior studies. I've also used a new statistical tool to examine whether the underidentification that we're reporting might be explained by unmeasured confounders. I can talk about this. That seems to be an unlikely explanation, particularly an unmeasured confounder that would be sufficient to overturn evidence of underidentification and yield evidence of over-identification consistent with federal monitoring. So what are the implications of these findings? Others have suggested that a lack of access to disability related services and treatments might help explain achievement gaps. Others have reported that schools are more likely to medicalize the problem behaviors of white children and more likely to criminalize the problem behaviors of students of color, such that white children are more likely, if they are displaying problem behaviors, to receive IEP or 504 plans or mental health services, whereas children of color are more likely to be suspended. So this lack of identification for potential disability might explain both achievement gaps and the school to prison pipeline. It suggests to us that the federal mandate around child find, that schools appropriately identify children who have disabilities and provide them assistance through special education, which is not, as far as I can tell, in any way enforced, is not being followed. That we find systemic evidence of bias in the way the system seems to be operating, such that you're much more likely to be identified as having a disability and receive assistance if you're white or English speaking relative to many other children of color displaying the same evident clinical need. It suggests to us that the federal government should be attempting to monitor for under-identification by approximating similarly situated contrasts. There's much evidence to suggest that the way that, well, there's ways to address this problem. I could talk about that. One of those, the two ways that have been talked about in public health is to establish what are called clinic to community partnerships, where members of the community are brought in to understand the signs, symptoms, and available treatments for disabilities, and then disseminate that in community settings, gyms, churches, barbershops, and as well as disseminating directly evidence-based but easy to access information about disability seems to be valued within minority communities. We should be trying to make sure that there's concerns about prejudice, stigma, quality of services are appropriately addressed. We don't want to be identifying children as having disabilities based on their race or ethnicity or their national origin. At the same time, we don't want to not be identifying children who have disabilities based on their race, ethnicity, or national origin. Other work has indicated that there are barriers to entry in terms of both health and educational care. Minority community members are less likely to be able to access health providers. Health providers are less likely to solicit developmental concerns for minority families. 95% of the due process materials that are provided to families about special education require at least some college level work to understand, which is probably function as a barrier to many families. We should be considering a clinical appropriateness and need when assessing for potential discrimination. And with that, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Sure.
Yeah. Now, I would like to get into the chat here, and let's take a peek at show previous. Okay. Ms. Peterson, would you like to address the question you posed regarding English language learners? Pearson, sorry, Ms. Pearson.
Sure. I'm happy to. I was asking the question, I know you looked based on ethnicity and race. I'm wondering if you also looked based on English language status, such as a student being EL?
Yes. Yes, and we find consistent evidence that if you are an English language learner, conditional on the other explanatory factors of the model, that you're less likely to be identified as having a disability.
And then if
So,
you don't mind,
yeah.
I have another question for you
sure.
too. You had mentioned the achievement and identification correlation. And there was one area where you talked about higher achieving students who were white led to greater identification of students from other races. Did I understand that correctly?
That's a good question. We do find, I haven't looked at this, I should look at this again, I should pull it up, but if memory serves, you can find some occasional evidence of significant differences between high achievers, such that if, again, I haven't looked at this in a bit, but such that I think if you're of color, you might be more likely to be identified as having a disability. But I would caution about that because it's a very unusual circumstance. You're very unlikely, based at least on our analyses, you're very unlikely to be identified as having a disability if you're displaying high achievement.
Okay, because we're
So
seeing over-identification in our area.
Okay.
When you're looking at like the ISB thresholds for identification, we're seeing over-identification of Hispanic students with learning disabilities that are 4 times the threshold. And I was wondering if,
Yeah.
and we're a higher achieving area. So I was
Okay.
wondering in this area if that research might align with what you were seeing.
It's if before it, let me say this. It's quite possible to find differences by group in terms of who's receiving services. And what we find doesn't dispute over-representation. We find that ourselves at times. But before inferring that the schools are biased in terms of their identification of students, including students of color or from non-English speaking households, I would like to see some attempt to account for clinical need. So if someone shows me a figure that says, look, children who are Hispanic are 4 times as likely to be receiving special education in our district than children who are white, then one of the things I would like to know is, well, are there achievement differences between those 2 populations? And if, to put it kind of simply, if Hispanic students are 4 times as likely to enter into the school displaying very low levels of achievement, then maybe it's not bias, maybe it's these other explanatory factors, including greater exposure to poverty or some other factors that are resulting in achievement differences. So we're not disputing that there might be evidence of overrepresentation, but what I am disputing is that necessarily leads to strong conclusions about bias. And I've seen a lot of language by others, including other academics, making strong claims about how special education is biased without accounting for differences in clinical need for services. So I'm all for, if that evidence, if you can show me that, or if that evidence is out there, of course I'd be concerned about that. But to answer the question, if there's some disproportionality that's occurring, to me, the way that we're looking at that doesn't take into account differences in clinical need. And the problem with that is we might be, I've heard so many stories about districts saying we've identified too many children of color. We can't identify any more children of color. And I kind of cringe at that because it means, well, then what if the student has a disability? I mean, again, we don't want to identify students as having disabilities if they don't have disabilities, including based on irrelevant background characteristics like their race or language use. But let's not keep children who have disabilities from getting additional help because of some arbitrary quota or because we've decided that somehow some numerical target has been met. I find that
Agreed.
type a type of inequity itself. So
Mhm.
it's a long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no,
It's
that's
late in the
great.
afternoon, but-
That's great.
Very helpful.
Agreed.
I think, Paul, if we may consider this, it seems like it's about explanation. It's about
Yeah.
how we explain things. For example, talk for a minute about lead and flint
Okay.
and water and environment, because you're talking about clinical need. That's one thing. Another thing is environmental contributors, so have a little,
Right.
yeah.
So this is hard for us as educators. And I used to be a special ed teacher myself. It's hard because we only know about the student in front of us. And oftentimes we don't have a lot of information about the students other than what has been observed in our educational settings or what we hear sort of anecdotally. Let me just step back for a moment. So the type of data we're analyzing, some of it some of the studies allow us to know a lot more about the children than is typical in many studies in education, including around this topic. And so we can have fairly extensive, for survey data, measures of medical histories of the children. And so, we know in the surveys about whether the child was born with low birth weight, for example. And then we can look about, well, how likely is that child to be identified as having a speech language impairment, when they enter kindergarten? And it turns out, that's a risk factor. That kind of information is usually lacking, in our school-based practices. To answer the question, there's a lot of focus right now in public health about what are called social determinants of health. So because of the way of historical and ongoing racialized practices, children of color are much more likely to experience the risk factors for disability, including exposure to lead. We saw this in Flint, highlighted so tragically. There's a greater attention to many of the factors that are societally arranged that result in health conditions across time. And our data and data of others helps us kind of understand and address these better, because in some data sets, we can follow the children from birth to kindergarten entry or from kindergarten entry to the end of 8th grade. And I can tell you just from my experience as an academic researcher, some of the things that you see is, early exposures matter. Early problems are highly predictive of later problems. Achievement gaps observed in 8th grade are often evident in kindergarten. So there's a lot of factors influencing children's development across time and across the life course. And some of these, we can identify and report on, and some of them we can't in our data sets. But when we examine these factors and include these other potential risk factors for disability, we do find that children of color are less likely to be identified. And again, we find that across many different data sets.
Intriguing. You have, in that short little duration, Paul, I think you have like cracked a very hard nut for those of us who really get beyond the extraordinary complexity of your work, because what you really seem to be getting after is more complex understanding of our work.
Yeah, I'm a fan of what we do. I believe in special education. Like any system. I mean, if I looked at dentistry, there'd be good dentists, not so good dentists, better resource dentists, less resource dentists. But I believe in dentistry. I believe in pediatric care, and so we have these systems, and the systems are designed to help different populations. And I think for our system in special education, we're a relatively new field. And when shortly after we started, there was some anecdotal and descriptive evidence that maybe the way the services are being provided was tended to be provided to certain populations more so than others. And that's led to inferences about bias. And again, I think there's been those concerns are certainly important to address. I completely understand the need to address those given the country's history, fully support those kind of investigations. But I don't think we should be maligning a whole system based on what I consider fairly limited descriptive evidence is inherently racially biased and inherently segregatory. And when our investigations try and test that and allow for evidence of both over or under identification, we find consistent evidence of unmet need that seems to be disadvantaging historically marginalized populations. And so I think we should try and address that as a field. I think an underappreciated aspect of our reporting is that it seems that there are many children who are from historically marginalized communities who are not receiving the care and treatment that they are entitled to. And I think that's important to address. I'm quite heartened to see that many in public health are citing our findings to motivate community engaged development of screening practices and interventions. I think there's just enormous health and educational equity implications for this work. And I just hope that it leads to better practice.
Interesting. Dr. Harris, would you like to make your point? Just unmute yourself there and make your point about dual identification.
I was just saying that, like in terms of looking at what was happening with that EL population of students, just looking at what are the tools that we are using to identify who those to identify those students as being disabled or non-disabled. I think that there's just a lot of value in also, just kind of giving consideration to that, because many tools are not designed for all populations, or there's some inherent bias that's built into it as well. So just being cognizant of that piece and how that might be contributing to the over-identification as well.
I think that's an excellent point. I completely agree, Dr. Harris. It's a complicated problem to separate a disability from being an emergent bilingual. And I think there's been some work that's attempted to develop more culturally and language sensitive tools to help with this problem. I think Lee Swanson has been doing some work in that area. I think there's another study by David Francis that just came out, I think, looking at this a bit. And there's a recent article on ER that looked at Tennessee and found similar evidence of underrepresentation of ELL students, similar to what we have found by a team whose name is escaping me at the moment, but it just came out maybe a couple months ago. Anyway, I think it's an important issue. I think, again, I think striking this balance between not identifying students who don't have disabilities and identifying students who do, I think is important. And in the case of ELL children, it's certainly, there's actual complications in regards to the language proficiency question.
Let's see, I'm hearing a lot of nice compliments, Dr. Morgan. Great, Dr. Pearson. We're looking at the assessment tools as part of our root cause analysis. Very interesting. There's so many variables that contribute. Patrick, would you like to to present your question to Dr. Morgan, just to hear how you might articulate your question on misinformed federal regulation as a causal factor?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks for your presentation, Dr. Morgan.
Yeah.
As I was listening, it sounds like your whole project was questioning this causal inference and finding that it's errant. And so I was wondering whether, kind of in light of what you're saying and what I think you heard certain administrators talking about, we can't identify anymore because we already have too many. I wonder whether you have sufficient data to be able to analyze whether these federal regulations possibly contributed to underrepresentation.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't would be simple. So I can get it's a great question. I can't provide an empirical answer to the question, well, how much are the federal regulations, policies, legislation resulting in underidentification? And I think that it's a good question to investigate, and I would love to know the answer myself. We can get a good bird's eye view of the direction of the estimate across, the country, say, or large regions, or even within specific contexts. But we can't identify the mechanisms per se that are resulting in the observed underidentification. I think the federal regulations are probably one of those. I think schools are, I would say that schools are, special education services are costly. The regulations are Byzantine. Schools are inclined not to provide services. I mean, they have to bear the costs themselves, the localities in the state, largely, not the federal government. The services are costly. Schools, not all schools, but many schools are disinclined to provide them. Children and families need to be informed and know about the services. And even then, and with sufficient economic resources, still experience great difficulty in obtaining services for their children. So I think those function as barriers in addition to the regulations. I think that there's concerns about stigma and prejudice in many minority families and communities that need to be addressed. A lack of information I talked about. I think there are multiple explanations of that. I'm hypothesizing based on my reading of other literatures that have found similar disparities. But my conjecture, but it's not an empirically based one, other than sort of anecdotal evidence that I have and what people tell me, is the regulations are not helping, right? And they're sort of, to me, misdirecting efforts, right? What's the problem? The problem, based on repeated empirical study using strong replicated empirical methods of longitudinal or very large repeatedly assessed cross-sectional samples, seems to be that children who are white and English speaking are more likely to be identified as having disabilities than similarly situated children of color or from non-English speaking households. That's what we keep finding. And many other teams have found that too. But yet the regulations are directed towards a completely different type of problem that we're not observing is occurring. So at the minimum, if there's concerns about bias, then the standard that should be used by OCR and OSEP and federal agencies is the one that's used in other fields, which is let's investigate for differential treatment among similarly situated children. And I think if you did that in a local context, you would tend to find what we're observing. The only thing I would add to that as an kind of as a bit of nuance is there is some evidence that the school context can matter somewhat, including for certain conditions. We've observed this, others have observed this. So as the racial composition of the school changes and is different from the students' racial and ethnic background, that can be related to the nature of the disparities. In our study using the OCR data, we do find some anomaly districts, and we report that in the study. There are some districts where the risk ratio is greater than what we would expect on the achievement gap. So it is possible that in certain contexts, there might be some bias that's operating, and that should be addressed. And again, it's an empirical question. But I would say from my own experience in doing these kind of work. On average, the nature of the problem is under-identification, not over-identification. And, you know, again, without strong empirical evidence, but I'll conjecture that the federal regulations are not helping and addressing a problem that's not largely occurring.
My goodness, how many more pressing questions may we address? Let's see, before we, Dr. Harris, you came back to us again, dear. Do you want to articulate recommend?
Yeah, I was just asking Dr. Morgan about any recommendations that he had regarding bias training. He kind of just spoke to it.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just thinking about how that can really kind of help with, or what your thought is on how it could really help with either over-identification
Mm-hmm.
or under-identification.
Yeah, great question. Bias is important to evaluate and consider. I would say a couple of things. As a practitioner, I think if the family is raising that, we definitely need to consider it as a potential explanation and rule it out. Some ways I would tend to want to rule it out would be, well, are the child's problems persistent, right? It seem to be going beyond just one teacher? Have we ruled out a lack of access to generally effective instruction, for example? If not over repeated grades, are we finding that the child's difficulties, say, are being observed by other teachers in other contexts? So that we're helping to rule out a particular teacher's potential bias, for example. There is some evidence by others suggesting that teachers can be biased, but the bias can operate such that they don't consider disability as a potential explanation for the child's struggles. Instead, they adopt stereotypes, and so they, a crude kind of way of putting it is they might expect low performance and not consider a disability as a reason for the low performance. So the bias can operate in kind of ways that might be resulting in either over or under identification. I would say that that making sure that we're providing, easily accessible, evidence-based information and taking into account concerns of the family, including about potential bias, is quite important from my perspective. So those are some things I would consider. Having the family speak to a provider in the school that may be of the same race, ethnicity, language use, that might also be helpful. I think, again, making sure that we're being responsive, appropriate, that the assessments are unbiased, the evidence that we've collected about this child's performances is as objective as possible. I think those are all just important best practice kind of mechanisms and practices that we might adopt to help address potential concerns around bias.
Good. Excellent. Makes a great deal of sense. Believe it or not, it's 4:01. I knew this would happen. Time just goes right by. Are there pressing questions before we end? And we thank you so much, Dr. Morgan, for being with us.
It was my pleasure.
It's a pleasure to hear you speak. And,
yeah.
May we hear any last pressing comment? With that, thank you so much, Dr. Morgan, for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you for your important work that you do to help children with disabilities.
This was a perfectly wonderful way to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Council for Exceptional Children.
Excellent.
Elizabeth Farrell would be a happy member of our audience.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much.